A late-night call can turn an ordinary life on its side. One ring, one breath, and suddenly the past is standing in your hallway, dripping rain onto the rug. That's what happened to me the night my ex's son, once a boy who left his muddy sneakers by my door, called with a voice trembling like a glass on a rattling table. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. It was a Tuesday that felt like it had borrowed its gray from November, even though the calendar insisted otherwise. I had finished my evening rituals, the kettle rinsed, the porch light switched on, the dog-eared book placed face down beside my reading glasses. The house breathed its familiar middle-of-the-week sigh. Then my phone buzzed with a number I hadn't saved but recognized all the same, as if the digits carried a memory in their arrangement. "Aye, it's Evan," the voice said, catching on the first consonant. "Do you have a minute?" Evan had been 12 the summer his father, and I tried to teach him how to grill without turning the burgers into hockey pucks. I could still see him, lanky and earnest, wearing a ball cap backward and trying to hide how much he liked the way I set a plate in front of him and said, "Eat while it's warm." Years had passed since I'd last heard his voice in my house, though his name still lived inside certain drawers, like the one with the bottle opener that sticks, because that's where daily life stores its small, stubborn ghosts. "Yes, sweetheart," I said without thinking, the old habit stepping out before caution could tidy it away. "I have a minute. Are you all right?" There was a pause, and in it I could hear the weight he was deciding whether to share. He exhaled, shy of a sigh. "I don't know," he said plainly. I didn't know who else to call this late. I walked to the window while he spoke and lifted the curtain the way you do when you expect weather to answer for everything. The street was a ribbon of dim light and sleeping cars. Far down the block, someone's porch lamp hummed, calling moths into their small orbit. "Tell me where you are," I said. "At my apartment," he said. "It's quiet, too quiet." He let a small laugh out, thin as paper. "I sound ridiculous." "You sound like a person at the end of a long day," I answered, then added carefully, "Would you like to talk now, or should we plan a time?" He took the invitation the way a tired traveler takes a seat. He told me about the job that paid the rent but left him carrying home a sack of words he didn't know what to do with. He told me about his father, my ex, whose temper had always been a weather pattern, unpredictable but familiar, now simmering into a forecast that made everyone check the sky twice. He talked about responsibility and worry, about being the one who steadies the boat but sometimes wishing someone would tell him it's okay to sit on the pier and watch the water. While he talked, I put the kettle on without a plan for the tea, because some gestures belong to the body before the mind asks for them. The click of the burner, the low hum as the coil warmed, the soft metallic settling of the kettle when it found its spot, they were household sounds, but they felt like a drumbeat beneath his story. "Do you remember the night of the thunderstorm?" he asked suddenly, and I could hear the hinge squeak on a door in his memory. "The lights went out and you lit those cinnamon candles, and you said we'd eat ice cream fast before it melted." I smiled, letting the image rise whole. 3 spoons, the rain arguing with the roof, the 3 of us at the kitchen table pretending the darkness was part of the plan. "I remember," I said. "Chocolate for your dad, vanilla for me, and you refusing to choose until I made a swirl." He laughed properly then, the sound landing in my ear like warmth. But when it faded, a quieter tone returned. "Sometimes I think about that night and how you made the storm feel." "Manageable," he said. "Like we could sit with it and still be okay." "I didn't calm the storm," I told him. "I just gave it fewer places to hide." The The kettle began its soft pre-whistle. I turned the knob and let the steam ghost the air. On the line, I could hear him shift, maybe standing at his window the way I had stood at mine. "Can I be honest?" he asked. The question tucked itself carefully between us. "Always," I said. The word had weight. I set it down gently. I called because his breath caught, then steadied. Because I wanted to hear someone say, "I'm not failing just because I'm tired." And I wanted to tell you something I should have said a long time ago, when you and my dad split. I was angry and confused, and I thought the best way to stay loyal was to be quiet around you. That wasn't fair. You were good to me, and I didn't know how to say thank you then. The house seemed to listen with me. Somewhere in the back, the refrigerator clicked, then settled. I sat at the kitchen table and traced a ring on the wood where a mug had once left its outline. "Even," I said, choosing my steps as if crossing a creek on stones. "No one expects a child to carry grown people's goodbyes. You were allowed to be confused. We were all learning how to walk on a new floor." "I know," he whispered, "but I still wanted you to know what I know now. You've showed up for school concerts, for late-night homework panics, for burnt pancakes on Sundays. You treated me like I mattered." His voice trembled, then cleared. I needed to say that out loud to the person who made it true. His words moved through me like the hush that follows a hymn. I felt that familiar, dangerous sting behind the eyes and looked toward the window so the room would blur before anything else did. I have learned that gratitude, when it arrives late, is not less real. It simply travels farther to reach you, and you can feel the miles in it. "Thank you for saying it," I replied. I meant it down to my marrow. It doesn't change the past, but it lights it differently. That matters. He breathed, one deep, relieved breath, as if the room he was in had just been given back a window. "I didn't want to make this about my dad," he said. "I wanted it to be about you and me, about what you gave me without asking for anything in return." "I did ask for one thing," I said, letting a small smile into my voice. "That you rinse your dishes." He chuckled, the sound unclenching something in both of us. "You'd be proud of my sink game now." We fell into an easier rhythm then, retying thin threads to thicker ones. He asked how I'd been, and I told him the true parts: the garden that kept insisting on tomatoes, the neighbor's dog that treated the mailman like a celebrity, the afternoons that came quiet and left quieter. I admitted that some evenings stretched like an unmarked road, and that I taught myself to fill them with small, steady projects, fixing a wobbly chair, hemming a curtain, learning to bake a loaf that looked better than it tasted. He listened with the same attention he'd once reserved for instructions on building a science fair volcano. "Would it be all right if I called again?" he asked at last. "Not to lean on you, just to talk. I think talking to you makes the night feel less complicated." "I'm glad to be called," I said. "But let's be clear about something. I won't be your midnight emergency room. I'll be your porch light. I can't stop the storm, but I can remind you where the steps are." "I can work with that," he said, and I could hear a smile shape the words. Then more quietly, "Thank you." When we ended the call, the house regained its old sounds. Clock in the hall, distant car rolling by, the soft settle of a picture frame finding its level on the wall. I sat for a while with my hands wrapped around a mug I hadn't poured, feeling the way a heart rearranges itself to make room for a truth spoken kindly. I thought of his father, not with bitterness, surprisingly, but with a complicated fondness that time had sanded smooth. That man and I could never quite keep our weather together. We ran out of names for our storms. But tucked inside that history was a boy who learned where the clean glasses were kept, who knew the sound of my laugh in the next room, who remembered cinnamon candles in the dark. Before I turned off the kitchen light, I wrote a note and stuck it to the fridge with the magnet shaped like a fat pear. Remember what is sturdy. It was for myself as much as for anyone. Some nights the only thing you can do is hold on to what doesn't tip over. I went to bed to the quiet my house and I had built together, the kind you make on purpose. Later, when I woke at 2 a.m., the hour that often invites old worries to take a seat, I reached for my phone and opened a blank note. I wrote down 3 words, porch light on. Then I set the phone face down and listened to the familiar dark breathe, not as a threat, but as a neighbor behind a shared wall. Sleep came back slowly, like a cat deciding you've earned its company. As I drifted, I thought of Evan in his quiet apartment, the small courage of a late call, the way truth can tremble and still make it all the way across a line. I didn't know what the days ahead would ask of either of us. How much steadiness, how much patience, how much remembering. But I did know this. Sometimes the most unexpected grace is not a grand fix, but the simple, consenting act of 2 people choosing to meet each other in the middle of the night with words that don't demand anything except honesty. When morning came, I found the note on the fridge right where I'd left it, and I let it be the first thing I obeyed. I brewed coffee, cracked the window to let in the almost autumn air, and stood in the kitchen that had heard our conversation like a vow. The light slanted across the table, turning the wood the color of warm bread. I set out 2 mugs by habit before catching myself, then left them both anyway. A small invitation to the day. A quiet promise that the story had begun again, not with fanfare, but with room enough to grow. The next few days after that late-night call carried a kind of echo. I went about my chores, folding laundry, writing a grocery list, watering the stubborn fern in the corner, but my mind kept drifting back to Evan's voice. It wasn't just what he said. It was the way it trembled, like he had been holding back a tide for too long. His words had left a mark, the kind that lingers quietly, waiting to be noticed again. I didn't expect him to call so soon, but 3 evenings later, just as I was settling into my chair with a book, the phone buzzed. His number appeared, and I felt that same little tug in my chest. When I answered, his tone was calmer, but there was still a thread of hesitation, like he was testing the strength of a bridge he'd only just begun to cross. "I hope I'm not bothering you," he said. "You're not," I told him. "I said the porch lights on, didn't I?" This time, he laughed more easily. He told me about his week, the long hours at work, the stack of bills that never seemed to shrink, the silence in his apartment that grew heavier after dark. He wasn't looking for advice, only a voice that would answer back. I listened the way I had when he was a boy explaining the rules of a video game I barely understood, nodding and making space for his excitement, his frustration, his need to be heard. We talked about small, ordinary things, too. I told him about the squirrel that had managed to outsmart every trick I tried to keep it out of my bird feeder. He teased me that I should surrender and start charging it rent. The conversation was simple, but it stitched a kind of comfort between us, like sewing patches into a quilt you know you'll need on a cold night. "Before hanging up," he said softly, "it feels lighter when I talk to you." After the call, I sat in the dim glow of the lamp, thinking about how strange it is that people can find each other again across time, after years of distance. Sometimes all it takes is one voice on the line to remind you that the bonds you thought were broken were really just waiting quietly, ready to be picked back up. And as I turned off the light and headed to bed, I realized something. The story between Evan and me wasn't finished after all. It had simply been paused, waiting for a moment like this to begin again. A week later, I found myself checking my phone in the evenings, half expecting his name to appear. It wasn't impatience, exactly, more a quiet readiness, the way you glance toward the window when you know a visitor might come down the walk. And sure enough, one Thursday night, the phone rang. His voice, though steadier this time, still carried that faint undertone, as if he were learning how to trust his own words again. "I didn't scare you off, did I?" he asked, almost joking. "Not at all," I said. "If anything, I've been wondering how you were." That seemed to loosen something in him, because he began to talk more freely. He told me about a rough day at work, how one mistake had felt larger than it really was, and how his father's sharp comments still replayed in his mind long after the moment had passed. Then, without prompting, he added, "But I remembered what you said about storms, about giving them fewer places to hide. So I wrote down what I was feeling, and it actually helped." I smiled into the phone. "That's exactly what I meant. When you name something, you take away some of its power." For a moment, there was only quiet on the line, and then he said, almost shyly, "I wish I'd listened to you more when I was younger." "You were listening," I told him. "You just didn't know you'd need those lessons yet." He chuckled softly, and the sound made me think of the boy I once knew, sitting at my kitchen table, trying to finish his homework before his father came home. The years between then and now suddenly felt less like a gap and more like a bridge we were walking together. That night, instead of rushing off, we lingered in the conversation. We talked about music, how he picked up his guitar again after years of leaving it in the corner, and about simple meals, the kind that make a place feel like home. He even asked for the recipe to my old cinnamon bread, the one I used to bake on Sundays. I promised to send it to him, though I warned him it would take patience to get it right. Before hanging up, he said something that stayed with me. "You make it easier to believe I'm not alone in this world." When the line went silent, I sat there for a long time, holding his words as carefully as if they were something fragile. The house felt warmer, though the heater hadn't clicked on. And I realized that what we were building wasn't just about mending the past. It was about creating a new space, one where honesty could live without fear, where both of us could discover that family doesn't always end when relationships do. Sometimes it reshapes itself, finding its own way forward. That night I wrote his words in my journal, "Not alone," and closed it gently, as if sealing a promise neither of us had fully spoken yet, but both of us were beginning to keep. Winter had begun to press its hand against the windows by the time the final call of that season came. The days were shorter, the nights deeper, and the world outside seemed determined to fold into silence earlier each evening. I had just lit a candle on the kitchen table, more for company than for light, when the phone rang again. Seeing his name, I felt the now familiar mix of anticipation and calm, as though my house had grown used to welcoming his voice. "Hey," Evan said. His tone was gentler, but also firmer somehow, like a man who had been practicing carrying his truth without dropping it. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You never do," I assured him. This time he didn't circle around his thoughts. He told me directly that he had started therapy, something he put off for years. He admitted it was difficult, that facing old pain sometimes felt like opening a door to a storm. But he also said he could hear my words when it got heavy, that storms can be managed when you give them fewer places to hide. I sat very still, letting the weight of his trust sink in. "I'm proud of you," I said, "not for being perfect, but for being willing to try." There was a pause, and then his voice lowered, trembling just slightly as it had that first night. "I need you to know something. When you and Dad split, I thought I lost you too. But these calls, they show me that I didn't. You've been a steady place for me, maybe more than you realize." I pressed a hand to the table, steadying myself against the surge of emotion. My eyes caught the flicker of the candle flame, wavering but unextinguished, and it felt like a mirror of what he had just said. "And you," I replied, "have reminded me that what we give, even quietly, can return when we least expect it. You've given me back something too." Neither of us rushed the silence that followed. It wasn't empty. It was full, carrying the years we had both traveled separately and the fragile new bridge we had built together. When we finally said goodbye, he added softly, "Thank you for being my porch light." After the line clicked quiet, I sat at the table with the candle burning low, the house warm despite the frost outside. His words repeated in my mind, settling not as an echo, but as a truth. I realized then that the story between us was not one of endings, but of beginnings, proof that connections can be reshaped, that family can survive in unexpected forms, and that sometimes the most powerful gift we can give each other is the permission to speak our truth without fear. I blew out the candle, watching the last ribbon of smoke drift upward, and I smiled. The light might fade for the night, but I knew it would be lit again, ready to guide him, or me, whenever it was needed.